Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a strange slice of history, a time when people believed tomatoes were deadly. Imagine fearing a salad ingredient. If you're into curious historical tales, do give this video a like and consider subscribing. It really helps the channel grow. And drop a comment below. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Always fascinating to see who's joining in from around the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for some background hum, and let's take a little nighttime journey together. The Devil's Apple, a memoir of the Court of Savoy, 1583. Being the true and faithful account of one Bartholomew Whitmore, formerly apothecary to His Grace the Duke of Savoy, concerning certain events in the year of our Lord 1583, when fear wore the mask of wisdom, and a single fruit nearly toppled a throne. I write these words by candlelight in my cottage near Ashford, my fingers grown stiff with age and the weight of memory. The quill trembles not from palsy, but from the knowledge that what I set down here has never been spoken aloud. Not in 40 years since that autumn when the Devil's Apple came to court, and I became the unwitting instrument of a tale so strange that even now, I wonder if I dreamt it all. But the scar upon my palm tells me otherwise. The thin white line that runs from thumb to wrist, where the knife slipped that October morning when everything changed. When I learned that a man might save a life by accident, and damn himself by intention. You must understand the world as it was then. England had found her sea legs under the Virgin Queen, and the ports buzzed with vessels bearing strange cargo from lands whose names we could scarce pronounce. The New World spilled its treasures onto our docks, silver and gold, yes, but also curious plants and fruits that our physicians viewed with deep suspicion. For how could God's bounty spring from soil touched by heathen feet? How could Christian stomachs digest what had been nurtured under foreign stars? I was 28 then, educated at Cambridge in the healing arts, though my true calling lay in the preparation of medicines and the cataloguing of herbs. The Duke of Savoy had summoned me to his court near Turin, where the mountain air was said to benefit those afflicted with the French malady, and where His Grace maintained the finest collection of medicinal plants this side of the Alps. I spoke passable Italian and adequate French, skills that served me well in a court where intrigue flowed as freely as the wine from His Grace's own vineyards. The Duke himself was a man caught between worlds. Charles Emmanuel I, they called him, though behind his back the courtiers whispered that he possessed the ambition of a Caesar trapped in the body of a merchant. His duchy lay at the crossroads of France and the Holy Roman Empire, and he played each great power against the other with the skill of a master chess player. Yet for all his political acumen, he possessed one weakness that would prove nearly fatal: an insatiable curiosity about the exotic. His private study overflowed with curiosities brought by traders and diplomats. Ostrich eggs from Africa, carved jade from far Cathay, dried serpents from the Indies whose venom was said to cure madness, and plants, endless varieties of plants, some beautiful, some bizarre, all carefully preserved in great glass vessels or planted in the heated greenhouses he had constructed behind the palace walls. It was there, in that cathedral of botanical wonders, that I first encountered the object of this tale. The morning arrived grey and cold, with a kind of dampness that seeps through stone walls and settles in one's bones. I had risen before dawn to prepare a tincture of willow bark for His Grace's persistent headaches, grinding the dried strips with a mortar that had belonged to my predecessor, a learned Venetian who had met his end after sampling a mushroom of unknown provenance. The irony was not lost on me as I worked. In our profession, curiosity and caution danced a deadly minuet. Brother Giacomo found me there as the first pale light filtered through the windows. He was the Duke's gardener, a Franciscan monk whose knowledge of plants bordered on the supernatural. His brown robes always smelled of earth and growing things, and his hands, permanently stained with soil, seemed to coax life from the most reluctant seeds. Maestro Bartholomew, he said, his voice carrying the soft cadence of the Piedmontese hills, His Grace requests your presence in the greenhouse. We have received something unusual. The way he spoke the word unusual made me set down my mortar and follow him without question. Brother Giacomo was not easily impressed. I had seen him handle deadly nightshade with the casual air of a man arranging flowers for the altar. We walked through corridors hung with tapestries depicting the Duke's ancestors, their painted eyes following our progress with the mixture of pride and suspicion that seemed to characterize all noble bloodlines. The palace breathed around us, timbers settling, servants' footsteps echoing from distant passages, the ever-present whisper of conspiracy that clung to court life like morning mist. The greenhouse stood apart from the main palace, connected by a covered walkway that protected tender souls from the mountain winds. Inside, the air hung thick and warm, heavy with the scent of exotic blooms and the earthier smell of rich soil. Rows of plants stretched into the misty distance, their leaves glistening with carefully maintained moisture. Some I recognized. Medicinal herbs from across Europe, spices that cost more than gold, flowering vines whose beauty masked deadly properties. Others remained mysteries, specimens gathered from the far corners of the known world. His Grace stood at the far end of the greenhouse, his purple doublet a splash of royal colour against the green abundance. Beside him waited a thin man in travel-stained clothes, his dark complexion and nervous manner marking him as one of the Italian merchants who plied the trade routes between the New World and the Old. But it was the object on the table before them that captured my attention completely. At first glance it appeared to be some manner of exotic fruit, though unlike any I had encountered in my studies. Roughly the size of a man's fist, it possessed an unusual shape, not quite round, but composed of several bulbous sections that gave it an almost sculptural quality. The skin glowed with the deep red of rubies, yet possessed an organic sheen that spoke of living flesh rather than precious stone. The merchant was speaking rapidly in a mixture of Italian and Spanish, his hands gesturing nervously as he described his cargo. I caught fragments. Pomodoro d'oro, he called it. The golden apple, though the specimen before us bore no resemblance to gold. From the Spanish territories, he continued, though the natives call it by another name, they eat them freely, Your Grace. Cook them in their stews and sauces. Silence, His Grace commanded, though not unkindly. He possessed the particular talent of all successful rulers, the ability to inspire both affection and terror with equal ease. Master Whitmore, approach. I stepped forward, my eyes never leaving the strange fruit. Even from several paces away I could detect its scent, green and sharp with an underlying earthiness that spoke of fertile soil and abundant rainfall. It was not unpleasant, but neither was it familiar, and in matters of food and medicine the unfamiliar demanded the utmost caution. "What make you of this, Master Apothecary?" His Grace asked, his voice carrying the particular tone he used when testing the knowledge of his advisers. I circled the table slowly, observing the specimen from all angles. The skin appeared smooth and taut, without blemishes or signs of decay. The colour was remarkably uniform, save for a slightly paler area near what I presumed to be the stem end. Most telling were the leaves still attached. They bore the distinctive serrated edges and particular arrangement that marked them as belonging to the same family as the deadly nightshade and the mandrake root. "Your Grace," I said carefully, "this fruit bears certain characteristics that give me pause. The leaf structure suggests kinship with plants of questionable virtue." The Duke's eyes sharpened. He was no fool, despite his love of exotic curiosities. "Explain yourself, Master." I gestured toward the specimen without touching it. "Observe the leaves, Your Grace. Note their shape and arrangement. They bear strong resemblance to those of the belladonna and the henbane, plants whose properties are well documented in the annals of medicine, and whose effects upon the human constitution are unpredictable." The merchant's face had grown pale during my discourse. "But your Grace," he protested, "in the Spanish colonies, they consume these freely. The natives prepare great feasts." "The natives," His Grace interrupted with the particular disdain he reserved for all things foreign and uncivilized, "also paint their faces blue and worship stone idols. Their dietary habits are hardly a recommendation for Christian consumption." I found myself studying the fruit with growing unease. In my years of training, I had learned that nature often marked her dangerous children with subtle signs, the particular sheen of poisonous berries, the too perfect beauty of deadly flowers. This specimen possessed an almost unnatural perfection, as if it had been crafted by an artist rather than grown from common soil. "There are other considerations, Your Grace," I continued, choosing my words with care. "The ancients believed that the constitution of food was influenced by the soil from which it sprang. This fruit comes from lands where the very air is said to be thick with vapours unknown to our physicians. Who can say what properties it might have absorbed during its growth?" The Duke nodded slowly. This was reasoning he could understand, the careful balance between curiosity and prudence that had kept him alive in a world where a single misstep could mean death. Yet I could see in his eyes the particular hunger that afflicted all collectors of rarities. He wanted to taste it, to be the first in all of Europe to sample this exotic delicacy. "Yet," he said, his voice carrying a note of calculated risk, "if the fruit proved wholesome, what a conversation piece it would make at tomorrow evening's feast. The French ambassador would be most impressed." Ah, there was the true motive. The Duke's political games extended even to his dinner table, where each dish served as a small move in the grand chess match of European diplomacy. To present something unknown to French palates would be a subtle assertion of Savoy's connections to the wider world, a reminder that even small duchies could command exotic luxuries. The merchant, sensing opportunity, pressed his advantage. "Your Grace, I have letters from Spanish physicians who attest to the fruit's wholesome properties. They claim it aids digestion and purifies the blood." But I had noticed something else about the specimen that filled me with deeper unease. The stem end, where it had been separated from the parent plant, bore a dark discoloration that spoke of rapid deterioration. Fresh fruits, in my experience, did not display such signs unless their inner nature was somehow unstable. "Your Grace," I said, my voice carrying more urgency than I had intended, "I would counsel extreme caution. Perhaps a small animal trial first. A rat or rabbit to observe any immediate effects." The Duke's expression grew thoughtful. This was prudent advice, the sort of methodical approach that had served him well in matters both political and personal. Yet I could see the struggle in his eyes, the collector's desire warring with the ruler's caution. "Very well," he said at length. "Master Whitmore, you shall conduct such a trial, but I want results by tomorrow morning. If the fruit proves safe, it shall grace my table at the evening's feast." The merchant bowed deeply, relief evident in every line of his body. For him this represented potential profit. If the Duke approved of his exotic wares, orders might follow for his entire cargo. But as I carefully gathered the specimen into a silk cloth, my hands trembling slightly at the contact, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Something about this fruit spoke to the deepest part of my training, the intuitive knowledge that warned of hidden dangers. The afternoon I spent in my private laboratory, a stone chamber beneath the palace where I prepared the Duke's medicines and conducted my botanical experiments. The room smelled of dried herbs and chemical preparations, with undertones of the charcoal brazier that kept the space tolerably warm. Shelves lined every wall, filled with bottles and jars containing substances both beneficent and deadly. For in my profession, the distinction often lay not in the substance itself, but in the dosage and application. I had selected 3 white rats from the cages I maintained for such purposes, creatures whose digestive systems bore enough resemblance to human anatomy to provide useful information. The first would receive a small portion of the fruit's flesh, the second a preparation of the seeds, and the third would serve as a comparison, receiving only bread and water. With a sharp knife, I carefully sectioned the fruit, noting how the blade passed through the flesh with unusual ease. The interior revealed itself to be even more peculiar than the exterior, divided into several chambers filled with small seeds suspended in a watery fluid. The seeds themselves were pale and flat, unlike any I had encountered in my botanical studies. The scent that arose from the cut fruit was stronger now, that green sharpness intensified by the release of internal vapours. It was not unpleasant, yet something about it seemed to bypass my conscious mind and speak directly to some deeper warning system. My hands, steady through years of precise work, developed a slight tremor as I prepared the samples. The flesh itself possessed an unusual texture, neither fully firm nor soft, but something in between. When pressed, it released more of that clear fluid, and the pressure left visible indentations that were slow to recover. This suggested a cellular structure unlike common fruits, though whether this indicated danger or merely exotic origin, I could not determine. As I fed the prepared samples to my test subjects, I found myself studying their immediate reactions with unusual intensity. This fruit comes from lands where the very air is said to be thick with vapours unknown to our physicians. Who can say what properties it might have absorbed during its growth? The Duke nodded slowly. This was reasoning he could understand, the careful balance between curiosity and prudence that had kept him alive in a world where a single misstep could mean death. Yet I could see in his eyes the particular hunger that afflicted all collectors of rarities. He wanted to taste it, to be the first in all of Europe to sample this exotic delicacy. Yet, he said, his voice carrying a note of calculated risk, if the fruit proved wholesome, what a conversation piece it would make at tomorrow evening's feast. The French ambassador would be most impressed. Ah, there was the true motive. The Duke's political games extended even to his dinner table, where each dish served as a small move in the grand chess match of European diplomacy. To present something unknown to French palates would be a subtle assertion of Savoy's connections to the wider world, a reminder that even small duchies could command exotic luxuries. The merchant, sensing opportunity, pressed his advantage. "Your Grace, I have letters from Spanish physicians who attest to the fruit's wholesome properties. They claim it aids digestion and purifies the blood." But I had noticed something else about the specimen that filled me with deeper unease. The stem end, where it had been separated from the parent plant, bore a dark discoloration that spoke of rapid deterioration. Fresh fruits, in my experience, did not display such signs unless their inner nature was somehow unstable. "Your Grace," I said, my voice carrying more urgency than I had intended, "I would counsel extreme caution. Perhaps a small animal trial first. A rat or rabbit to observe any immediate effects." The Duke's expression grew thoughtful. This was prudent advice, the sort of methodical approach that had served him well in matters both political and personal. Yet I could see the struggle in his eyes, the collector's desire warring with the ruler's caution. "Very well," he said at length. "Master Whitmore, you shall conduct such a trial, but I want results by tomorrow morning. If the fruit proves safe, it shall grace my table at the evening's feast." The merchant bowed deeply, relief evident in every line of his body. For him this represented potential profit. If the Duke approved of his exotic wares, orders might follow for his entire cargo. But as I carefully gathered the specimen into a silk cloth, my hands trembling slightly at the contact, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Something about this fruit spoke to the deepest part of my training, the intuitive knowledge that warned of hidden dangers. The afternoon I spent in my private laboratory, a stone chamber beneath the palace where I prepared the Duke's medicines and conducted my botanical experiments. The room smelled of dried herbs and chemical preparations, with undertones of the charcoal brazier that kept the space tolerably warm. Shelves lined every wall, filled with bottles and jars containing substances both beneficent and deadly. For in my profession, the distinction often lay not in the substance itself, but in the dosage and application. I had selected 3 white rats from the cages I maintained for such purposes, creatures whose digestive systems bore enough resemblance to human anatomy to provide useful information. The first would receive a small portion of the fruit's flesh, the second a preparation of the seeds, and the third would serve as a comparison, receiving only bread and water. With a sharp knife I carefully sectioned the fruit, noting how the blade passed through the flesh with unusual ease. The interior revealed itself to be even more peculiar than the exterior, divided into several chambers filled with small seeds suspended in a watery fluid. The seeds themselves were pale and flat, unlike any I had encountered in my botanical studies. The scent that arose from the cut fruit was stronger now, that green sharpness intensified by the release of internal vapours. It was not unpleasant, yet something about it seemed to bypass my conscious mind and speak directly to some deeper warning system. My hands, steady through years of precise work, developed a slight tremor as I prepared the samples. The flesh itself possessed an unusual texture, neither fully firm nor soft, but something in between. When pressed, it released more of that clear fluid, and the pressure left visible indentations that were slow to recover. This suggested a cellular structure unlike common fruits, though whether this indicated danger or merely exotic origin, I could not determine. As I fed the prepared samples to my test subjects, I found myself studying their immediate reactions with unusual intensity. The first rat, receiving the flesh, consumed it readily enough, showing no sign of distress or reluctance. The second, given the seed preparation, was more hesitant, but eventually consumed the offering when presented with no alternative. Both animals appeared normal in the hours following consumption, alert, active, responsive to stimuli. By evening, when I made my final observations before retiring, they showed no signs of distress. Their breathing remained regular, their movements coordinated, their appetites undiminished. Yet sleep, when it finally came, brought with it dreams that left me gasping and sweat-soaked before dawn. I stood in a great hall filled with nobles dressed in finery I could not quite recall upon waking. The air shimmered with heat and the scent of exotic spices, and at the centre of the room sat a table laden with dishes I had never seen. Each plate held portions of that red fruit, prepared in ways that seemed both elegant and somehow obscene. The nobles ate with obvious relish, their faces glowing with satisfaction and something else, a kind of fevered excitement that made their eyes shine like polished stones. But as I watched, their expressions began to change. The satisfaction faded, replaced by confusion, then concern, then mounting terror. One by one they began to rise from their seats, their movements becoming jerky and uncontrolled. Their mouths opened as if to speak, but no words emerged, only a sound like wind through empty chambers. The Duke sat at the head of the table, his face pale as parchment, his eyes fixed on me with an expression of such betrayal that I felt my heart crack within my chest. He raised one trembling hand toward me, as if in accusation, and his lips formed words I could not hear but somehow understood. You knew, and yet. I woke with those phantom words echoing in my mind, my nightshirt soaked through despite the chamber's chill. The dream clung to me like spider silk, impossible to fully shake even as I rose and dressed by candlelight. Outside my window, the first pale hints of dawn touched the mountain peaks, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled the hour with slow, measured strokes that seemed to count down to some approaching doom. My rats remained healthy. 3 days of observation revealed no ill effects from their consumption of the exotic fruit. They ate normally, moved with their usual quick energy, and showed no signs of the distress that would indicate poisoning. By any reasonable measure, the trial had proven the fruit's safety. Yet the dream haunted me. Not merely its content, for dreams, as any learned man knows, often spring more from yesterday's dinner than tomorrow's prophecy, but the peculiar clarity with which it had impressed itself upon my memory. I could recall every detail, the exact shade of red that had stained the noble's lips, the particular way the candlelight had reflected off the Duke's terrified eyes, the sound of my own heartbeat thundering in my ears as I watched the scene unfold. When Brother Giacomo found me in my laboratory that morning, I was sitting at my work table, staring at the remaining portions of the fruit that I had preserved in spirits of wine. The specimens floated in their glass vessel like creatures from some underwater realm, their red flesh pale and ghostly in the pale liquid. "The Duke awaits your report," the monk said softly, his earth-stained hands clasped behind his back. "The French ambassador arrived in the night, and his Grace is most eager to proceed with this evening's feast." I nodded slowly, unable to tear my gaze from those suspended fragments. In the harsh light of morning, my concern seemed foolish, the product of an overactive imagination, and too many years spent cataloguing the ways that plants could kill. The rats were healthy. The Spanish colonists consumed these fruits freely. What grounds did I have for concern beyond an old man's superstition and a vivid dream? "Tell his Grace that the trials have proven inconclusive," I said at length. "The animals show no immediate ill effects, but the time frame may be insufficient for a complete assessment." Brother Giacomo's eyebrows rose slightly. "Inconclusive? Master, you have conducted such trials many times before. Surely 3 days' observation provides adequate evidence." He was right, of course. 3 days represented the standard period for detecting most forms of plant toxicity. If the rats had survived that long without symptoms, the fruit could be considered safe for human consumption. My hesitation flew in the face of established protocol and rational analysis. Yet something deep in my scholar's training whispered warnings I could not ignore. The fruit belonged to a family of plants known for their unpredictable properties. Its origins lay in lands whose very soil might harbour influences unknown to European medicine. And beneath it all lay that dream, not as evidence, for dreams proved nothing, but as nagging reminder that sometimes the deepest wisdom spoke in whispers that reason could not hear. "I require more time," I said firmly. "Perhaps another day or two of observation. The stakes, brother, are too high for hasty conclusions." The monk studied my face with the particular intensity of one who had spent years reading the subtle signs of plant health and disease. Whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy him, for he nodded slowly. "I will convey your message to his Grace," he said, "though I suspect he will not be pleased. The menu for tonight's feast has already been planned around this exotic centerpiece." After he departed, I found myself alone with my doubts and my specimens. The laboratory felt smaller somehow, as if the stone walls had drawn closer during the night. The familiar sense of my trade, dried herbs, chemical preparations, the earthy smell of preserved specimens, seemed sharper, more insistent. Even the rats in their cages appeared to watch me with unusual attention, their dark eyes reflecting the candlelight like tiny stars. I spent the morning reviewing my notes from the previous days, searching for any detail I might have overlooked. The animals' behaviour patterns, their food consumption, their physical condition, all remained within normal parameters. By every measure I knew, the fruit posed no danger. Yet as the hours passed, my unease only deepened. The summons came at midday, delivered by a page whose nervous manner suggested that his Grace's displeasure had reached levels that affected the entire court. I found the Duke in his private study, a chamber filled with maps, books, and the various curiosities that marked him as a man of wide interests and dangerous ambitions. He stood with his back to me, gazing out a window that overlooked the courtyard where servants scurried about preparing for the evening's festivities. His hands were clasped behind his back, and the set of his shoulders suggested barely contained frustration. "Master Whitmore," he said without turning around, I am told that your trials remain inconclusive. Your Grace, I believe caution would be caution. He turned to face me, and I saw in his eyes the particular anger of a ruler whose will has been questioned. Master, I have built this duchy on calculated risks. Every alliance, every treaty, every trade agreement represents a balance between potential gain and possible loss. Now you ask me to abandon an opportunity to impress a French ambassador, a man whose favour could mean the difference between prosperity and poverty for my people, because of inconclusive results from a test that has proven adequate for every other substance in your laboratory. He gestured toward the window, where the sounds of preparation drifted up from the courtyard below. The feast begins at sunset. The French delegation expects to be surprised, impressed, perhaps even astonished by the hospitality of our humble duchy. This fruit, this exotic curiosity from the New World, represents exactly the sort of gesture that creates lasting diplomatic bonds. I understood his frustration. In the delicate dance of European politics, small gestures often carried enormous weight. A duke who could present novelties unknown to the French court demonstrated connections and resources that commanded respect. To withdraw such an offering at the last moment would be seen as weakness, or worse, as incompetence. Your Grace, I said carefully, what if we were to present the fruit as a curiosity rather than as food? The French delegation would be equally impressed by its exotic nature, without the risks of consumption. The Duke's expression suggested that I had missed the point entirely. Master, anyone can display curiosities. Merchants and collectors fill their shops with such oddities. But to serve food that no European palate has tasted? To share the bounty of distant lands with one's guests? That represents power of an entirely different magnitude. He moved to his desk and picked up a letter bearing an official seal. I've received word from Madrid that these fruits are indeed consumed regularly in the Spanish territories. The Viceroy of New Spain includes them in his own household diet. Are we to be more cautious than the Spanish Empire? The argument was compelling, I had to admit. If the Spanish colonial authorities trusted these fruits enough to include them in their regular fare, what grounds did I have for continued skepticism? My rats remained healthy, my tests had revealed no immediate dangers, and my only substantial concern rested on a botanical relationship that might prove meaningless in practice. Yet something in the Duke's manner, a particular intensity in his gaze, a tension in his posture, suggested that this decision carried weight beyond its diplomatic implications. I had served at his court long enough to recognize the signs of a man caught between competing pressures, and I sensed that forces beyond my understanding were influencing this seemingly simple matter of menu planning. Your Grace, I said at length, if you're determined to proceed, might I suggest a compromise? Perhaps we could prepare only a small quantity, enough to demonstrate goodwill without committing the entire gathering to consumption of an unfamiliar substance. The Duke considered this suggestion, his expression softening slightly. A taste, you mean? Just enough to honour the gesture without excessive risk. Precisely, Your Grace. A few slices, artfully arranged, presented as a rare delicacy to be savoured rather than consumed in quantity. This seemed to satisfy him, for his posture relaxed, and the anger faded from his eyes. Very well, Master Whitmore. You shall prepare such a presentation, but I want it to be memorable, something that will have the French ambassador writing to Paris about the sophistication of our court. As I bowed and prepared to withdraw, he called after me. And Master, I trust that your caution will not extend to any public expression of doubt about the dish's safety. The effectiveness of this gesture depends upon the confidence with which it is presented. I nodded, understanding perfectly. Whatever my private reservations, my public role required me to appear fully supportive of the Duke's decision. The diplomatic implications of any perceived hesitation could indeed prove catastrophic for the Duchy's interests. Yet, as I returned to my laboratory to begin preparations, I found myself wondering whether I was being prudent or cowardly, wise or foolish. The distinction, I had learned, often became clear only in retrospect. and by then the consequences were already irreversible. The afternoon passed in a blur of preparation. I selected the finest remaining specimens from my preserved samples, those with the most appealing colour and unblemished skin. Under normal circumstances, I would have consulted with the Duke's master cook about presentation and preparation, but something made me reluctant to involve others in this enterprise. Instead, I worked alone, slicing the fruit into thin sections that displayed its unusual internal structure to best advantage. Each piece revealed those peculiar chambers filled with seeds, creating a pattern that was undeniably exotic and visually striking. I arranged them on a silver platter, garnished with herbs from Brother Giacomo's garden, that would complement the fruit's sharp scent without overwhelming it. The final result was indeed memorable, a presentation that spoke of distant lands and exotic flavours, arranged with the precision that marked all sophisticated court cuisine. Any ambassador would be impressed by both the rarity of the offering and the skill with which it had been presented. Yet, as I carried the platter through the palace corridors toward the great hall, I felt as though I were carrying something far more dangerous than mere fruit. Each step seemed to echo with unnatural resonance, and the shadows cast by flickering torches appeared to writhe and dance with malevolent life. The great hall buzzed with conversation, and the rustle of fine clothing as nobles from across the region gathered to witness this diplomatic occasion. The French ambassador and his retinue occupied places of honour at the Duke's right hand, their elegant attire and sophisticated manner marking them as representatives of Europe's most powerful kingdom. I took my assigned place at the servants' table, from where I could observe the proceedings without drawing undue attention. The meal progressed through its customary courses: roasted meats, elaborate confections, wines from the Duke's finest cellars. The conversation flowed as smoothly as the wine, touching upon matters of trade, politics, and cultural exchange with the careful precision of professional diplomats. Then came the moment I had been dreading. His Grace rose from his seat, drawing the attention of the entire assembly. In his hands he held the silver platter bearing my carefully arranged presentation, and his expression carried the particular satisfaction of a man about to spring a calculated surprise. "Excellency," he addressed the French ambassador, "I have the honour to present a delicacy that has never before graced European tables. From the Spanish territories of the New World comes this fruit, which the natives call by names that our tongues can scarce pronounce, but which represents the bounty of lands beyond our traditional horizons." The ambassador leaned forward with obvious interest, his trained diplomatic eye taking in every detail of the exotic presentation. "Your Grace's reputation for hospitality precedes you," he replied, with the smooth courtesy of his profession, "but this exceeds even the most generous expectations." Other guests crowded closer to examine the unusual offering, their faces reflecting mixtures of curiosity and caution. I recognized several fellow physicians among the gathering, their expression suggesting the same botanical concerns that had troubled me. Yet none spoke aloud. The social pressures of the moment demanded enthusiastic approval rather than scholarly debate. The Duke selected one of the larger slices with ceremonial precision, holding it up to the candlelight so that its translucent flesh glowed like stained glass. "To friendship between nations," he proclaimed, "and to the courage required to embrace the unknown." My heart hammered against my ribs as he brought the fruit to his lips. This was the moment when all my preparations and precautions would prove either wise or meaningless, when the careful balance between caution and boldness would tip toward triumph or disaster. The Duke bit into the fruit with deliberate ceremony, chewing slowly while the entire assembly watched in fascination. His expression remained carefully neutral as he savoured the exotic flavour, giving no indication of his reaction until he had swallowed completely. Then, to my enormous relief, he smiled. "Remarkable," he declared. his voice carrying genuine pleasure, a flavour both familiar and entirely new, sharp like wine yet substantial like meat, with the undertones that speak of sun-warmed earth and distant rains. The ambassador accepted his portion with the gracious manner of a man who had dined in courts across Europe. His first taste was cautious, exploratory, but his expression quickly shifted to one of genuine appreciation. "Extraordinary, Your Grace. The texture alone would make this conversation piece, but the flavour, it suggests possibilities for cuisine that we have never imagined." Other guests followed their lead, each sampling the exotic offering with the mixture of bravery and nervousness that marked all encounters with the genuinely unknown. I watched their faces intently, searching for any sign of distress or unusual reaction, but saw only the expected range of responses to an unfamiliar food: surprise, curiosity, gradual acceptance. The evening continued without incident. Conversations resumed their normal flow, wine continued to circulate, and the diplomatic objectives of the gathering appeared to be met with complete success. The French ambassador complimented his host repeatedly on the evening's innovations, and I could see in the Duke's manner the particular satisfaction of a gamble that had paid handsome dividends. Yet I found myself unable to fully relax. Something about the entire proceedings felt wrong, though I could not identify any specific cause for concern. The fruit had been consumed without immediate ill effect. The guests appeared healthy and content, and the diplomatic mission had succeeded beyond all reasonable expectations. Perhaps it was merely the lingering influence of that peculiar dream, or the natural nervousness of a man who had staked his professional reputation on an uncertain venture. Whatever the cause, I remained alert throughout the remainder of the evening, watching the guests for any sign that my preparations had been inadequate. None came. The assembly dispersed near midnight, with the French delegation retiring to their assigned chambers in obvious good spirits. The Duke himself appeared vigorous and satisfied, showing no effects from his consumption of the exotic fruit beyond a slight flush that could easily be attributed to wine and social triumph. I returned to my laboratory with feelings that mixed relief with lingering unease. By every reasonable measure, the evening had proven my caution unnecessary and my preparations adequate. The fruit was safe, the diplomatic objectives had been met, and my reputation as court apothecary remained intact. Yet sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams even more vivid than those that had tormented me before. I stood again in that spectral great hall, but now the scene had changed. The same nobles sat at their familiar places, but their faces bore expressions of deep contentment rather than terror. They consumed the red fruit with obvious pleasure, savouring each bite as if it were ambrosia from the gods themselves. But as I watched, I began to notice subtle changes in their appearance. Their skin took on a healthier glow, their eyes shone with unusual brightness, and their movements possessed a grace and energy that seemed almost supernatural. They appeared not merely well, but transformed, elevated somehow to a state of being that transcended normal human limitations. The Duke, seated at the head of the table, caught my eye and smiled with an expression of profound gratitude. "You see, Master Whitmore," he said, his voice carrying a resonance that seemed to vibrate in my very bones, "you have given us more than mere sustenance. You have opened a door to possibilities we never imagined." But even as he spoke these words of praise, I noticed something that filled me with deeper horror than any nightmare of poison or death. The nobles were beginning to change in ways that transcended the merely physical. Their humanity itself seemed to be shifting. taking on qualities that belonged to no earthly realm I recognised. I woke gasping, my heart racing with a terror that had no rational foundation. The dream had been pleasant, even triumphant, yet it left me with a sense of dread that far exceeded anything I had experienced during my darkest visions of toxicity and death. Morning brought news that initially seemed to confirm my successful navigation of the previous evening's challenges. A messenger arrived from the French ambassador expressing His Excellency's continued appreciation for the Duke's hospitality and his particular interest in establishing trade connections that might bring more of those exotic delicacies to European tables. Similar messages arrived throughout the day from other guests, all expressing enthusiasm for the novel experience and requesting information about how they might obtain similar fruits for their own establishments. The social success of the evening appeared complete, and the Duke's political objectives had been exceeded by a comfortable margin. Yet, as the day progressed, I began to receive visitors whose concerns echoed my own deeper anxieties. Brother Giacomo was the first, appearing at my laboratory door with his characteristic quiet manner, but carrying an expression of unusual tension. He accepted my offer of wine, but barely touched it, his attention focused entirely on the discussion at hand. "Master," he said without preamble, "I have been thinking about last evening's innovation. The fruit you served, it troubles me in ways I find difficult to express." I leaned forward, eager to hear concerns that might validate my own persistent unease. "In what way, brother?" "The botanical family," he replied, his earth-stained hands gesturing as if trying to capture elusive concepts. "I have spent 30 years studying the plants of this region, learning their properties and relationships. The leaves of this exotic specimen bear unmistakable resemblance to those of the deadly nightshade, yet its fruit appears benign. In my experience, nature rarely creates such contradictions without purpose." This was precisely the concern that had haunted me from the beginning, though Brother Giacomo's expression carried implications that went beyond mere botanical classification. "You suspect some hidden property?" I asked. "I suspect," he said carefully, "that we may not fully understand what we've introduced to His Grace's table. The indigenous peoples of distant lands have had centuries to learn the proper use of such plants, which parts to consume, in what quantities, at what seasons. We possess no such knowledge." He paused, taking a small sip of his wine before continuing. "But what concerns me more deeply is the enthusiasm with which last evening's innovation has been received. I have served this court for many years, Master, and I've rarely seen such unanimous approval for any change, however small. It strikes me as unnatural." This observation sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the laboratory stone walls. Brother Giacomo was right. The reaction to the exotic fruit had been remarkably positive, almost suspiciously so. Courtiers were normally divided on any innovation, with factions forming around competing opinions and personal loyalties. Yet last evening's presentation had generated nothing but praise. "What do you suggest, brother?" "Continued observation," he replied immediately. "Not of animals this time, but of the humans who consume the fruit. Watch for changes in behaviour, in disposition, in anything that might indicate effects beyond the merely nutritional." After he departed, I found myself reviewing the events of the previous evening with new attention to details I had previously overlooked. The unanimous enthusiasm, the particular brightness in the guests' eyes, the almost excessive gratitude expressed by the Duke himself, all took on different meanings when viewed through Brother Giacomo's lens of suspicion. But the most disturbing visit came near sunset, when Dr. Cornelius Van Houten arrived at my laboratory. Dr. Van Houten served as personal physician to one of the minor nobles who had attended the previous evening's feast, and his reputation for learning and discretion had earned him the trust of several prominent families. He was a thin, intense man whose dark clothing and careful manner marked him as someone who took his professional responsibilities with utmost seriousness. He entered without ceremony, his pale eyes scanning the laboratory's contents with the practiced assessment of one familiar with the tools of healing and harming. When he spoke, his voice carried the particular gravity reserved for matters of life and death. "Master Whitmore," he said, declining my offer of refreshment, "I come to you with concerns that I dare not voice in public corridors. My patron, Count Alessandro, consumed a portion of that exotic fruit last evening. Today he exhibits changes that I find deeply troubling." My blood chilled. "What manner of changes?" Dr. Van Houten moved closer, lowering his voice to barely above a whisper. "Physical alterations that defy my understanding of human constitution. His pulse has become remarkably slow and steady. So much so that I initially feared he had succumbed to some paralytic agent. Yet he moves with unusual grace, and his strength appears enhanced rather than diminished." He paused, studying my face for reaction before continuing. "But more disturbing still are the changes in his mental faculties. The Count has always been a man of moderate intelligence and conventional thinking. Today he speaks of concepts that suggest learning far beyond his previous capacity. He discusses philosophical matters with the fluency of a university scholar and demonstrates knowledge of languages he has never studied. The implication struck me like a physical blow. If the fruit possessed properties that could alter human consciousness in such fundamental ways, then my careful animal trials had been worse than useless. They had provided false reassurance about dangers that manifested only in more complex organisms. "Have you observed similar changes in other guests from last evening?" I asked. I feared the answer. "That is why I come to you in private," Dr. Van Houten replied. "I have made discreet inquiries among my professional colleagues. Each reports similar observations in their patients: enhanced physical capabilities, expanded mental capacity, but all accompanied by subtle changes in personality that suggest something beyond normal human enhancement." He moved to examine one of my specimen bottles, his reflection wavering in the glass as he spoke. "Master, I have studied medicine for 20 years, and I have never encountered a substance that could produce such effects without obvious toxicity. Either we are witnessing some form of miraculous transformation, or we are observing the early stages of a condition whose ultimate consequences remain unknown." The word transformation echoed in my mind with particular resonance, recalling the dream imagery that had haunted my sleep. If the fruit possessed properties that could alter human nature itself, then the implications extended far beyond individual health, into realms of philosophy and theology that I was ill-equipped to navigate. "What course do you recommend?" I asked. "Continued observation, as you would with any experimental treatment," he replied immediately, "but conducted in absolute secrecy, for if word of these changes reaches the wrong ears, we could face accusations of witchcraft or worse." This consideration had not occurred to me, but Dr. Van Houten's concern was entirely justified. The Church's position on substances that altered human nature was uncompromising, and even the suggestion that we had introduced some form of transformative agent into noble bloodlines could result in charges that would end with flames rather than exile. "I propose we establish a network of discreet observation," he continued. monitor the affected individuals without their knowledge, document any changes, and be prepared to act if the situation deteriorates. After his departure, I found myself alone with fears that had moved far beyond my original concerns about simple toxicity. If the fruit possessed the power to alter human consciousness and capability, then I had potentially unleashed forces that could reshape the social order itself. Enhanced nobles with expanded mental faculties might prove resistant to traditional forms of governance. Physical improvements could upset military balances that had maintained peace for generations. Yet even as these political implications troubled me, deeper questions gnawed at my scholarly curiosity. What were the ultimate limits of the changes Dr. Van Houten described? Would they continue indefinitely, or reach some natural plateau? Most importantly, were these alterations permanent, or might they prove temporary, wearing off as the fruit's influence faded from the system? I spent the evening reviewing every text in my collection that dealt with consciousness-altering substances. The ancient Greeks had written of divine madness induced by certain plants. Medieval scholars had documented cases of enhanced perception following consumption of various fungi. But none of these historical accounts suggested transformations as fundamental as those Dr. Van Houten described. Sleep brought no relief from my concerns. The dreams that night were chaotic, fragmented visions of nobles who had transcended their human limitations, only to become something that could no longer be called entirely human. I saw the Duke leading armies with strategic brilliance that exceeded mortal capacity, yet commanding troops who recoiled from their leader's transformed presence. I witnessed courtiers engaging in philosophical debates that revealed truths too profound for unenhanced minds to comprehend, yet speaking in voices that carried no trace of their former humanity. I woke before dawn with a certainty that crystallized like ice in my chest. Whatever we had begun the previous evening was far from finished, and the consequences would extend far beyond any diplomatic dinner party. The third day brought confirmation of my worst fears. A message arrived from Dr. Van Houten requesting an urgent meeting, delivered by a servant whose nervous manner suggested that discretion was paramount. We met in the palace chapel during the morning service, when the echoing hymns would mask our whispered conversation from any potential eavesdroppers. His report confirmed that the changes in the affected nobles were not only continuing but accelerating. Count Alessandro had demonstrated the ability to read texts in Latin and Greek, despite having no previous knowledge of either language. More disturbing still, he had begun making predictions about political developments that proved uncannily accurate, as if his enhanced mental faculties included some form of prescient capability. "But Master," Dr. Van Houten whispered as we knelt in apparent prayer, "what troubles me most deeply is that he no longer seems entirely present. When he speaks, there are moments when his eyes focus on something beyond the physical world, as if he perceives realities invisible to normal human senses." Other physicians had reported similar observations: enhanced physical strength, expanded intellectual capacity, but accompanied by a growing detachment from ordinary human concerns. The affected individuals appeared to be evolving beyond their previous limitations, yet the direction of that evolution remained unclear. "We must inform His Grace," I said, though the words felt like stones in my throat. Dr. Van Houten's expression suggested he had anticipated this conclusion. "Perhaps, but consider the implications, Master. If these changes prove permanent, they could represent the emergence of a new form of human existence, one possessed of capabilities that current political and social structures cannot accommodate. If they prove temporary, we may witness a catastrophic return to baseline that could destroy minds unprepared for such transitions. The philosophical implications were staggering. If the fruit could genuinely enhance human consciousness, it represented a discovery that would fundamentally alter mankind's understanding of its own limitations. Yet if those enhancements came at the cost of humanity itself, the price might prove too high for any reasonable person to accept. "There is another consideration, Doctor," Van Houten continued, his voice barely audible above the chapel's acoustics. "Several of the affected nobles have begun seeking each other's company, as if they recognize something in their transformed peers that sets them apart from unenhanced individuals. They speak of forming associations based on their shared condition. This development filled me with particular dread. Enhanced individuals forming alliances could represent the beginning of a new social order, one in which ordinary humans might find themselves relegated to positions of permanent inferiority. The political implications alone could destabilize every existing power structure in Europe. "How long," I asked, "before these changes become impossible to conceal?" "Days, perhaps weeks at most. The affected individuals grow less concerned with maintaining normal appearances, and their enhanced capabilities become more evident with each passing day." We agreed to continue our discreet observations while preparing for the possibility that public revelation might prove inevitable. Yet as I left the chapel, I carried with me the growing certainty that we had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return. The afternoon brought an unexpected summons from His Grace himself. I found him in his private study, but his appearance struck me as subtly altered from our previous meeting. His posture carried a new authority. His movements possessed an economy that suggested enhanced physical coordination, and his eyes held a particular intensity that seemed to perceive far more than they revealed. "Master Whitmore," he said without preamble, "I have been experiencing certain developments since our diplomatic triumph 3 evenings past. I believe it would be wise to discuss these changes frankly." My heart hammered against my ribs as I realized that the Duke himself was among the affected individuals. If the ruler of the duchy had undergone the same transformation as his guests, the political implications became exponentially more complex. "Your Grace, what manner of developments?" He moved to the window that overlooked his domain, his gaze encompassing territories that stretched to the horizon. "Enhanced perception, Master. I find myself understanding political relationships and economic factors with a clarity that was previously impossible. Patterns that once remained hidden now reveal themselves with perfect transparency." He turned to face me, and I saw in his expression a mixture of gratitude and something else, a kind of transcendent satisfaction that belonged to no earthly emotion I recognized. "The fruit you prepared has given me capabilities that will transform this duchy's position in European politics. I can now negotiate with France and the Empire from a position of intellectual superiority that will benefit my people for generations to come." The enthusiasm in his voice carried an undertone that chilled me. This was not merely political calculation, but something approaching religious fervour, as if the enhancement he described had become the central fact of his existence. "Your Grace," I said carefully, "have you considered the possibility that these changes might prove temporary?" His expression shifted to one of mild surprise, as if the concept of temporality had become foreign to his enhanced understanding. "Master, why would one wish such capabilities to be temporary? I have been given the opportunity to transcend human limitations, to become something greater than nature originally intended. The very question suggests a failure to comprehend the magnitude of this gift. The word gift resonated with implications that extended far beyond medical or scientific consideration. If the Duke viewed his transformation in religious terms, then any attempt to reverse or mitigate the process would be seen not as healing, but as sacrilege. "Yet, Your Grace," I persisted, "we possess no knowledge of the long-term effects of this enhancement. The indigenous peoples from whom this fruit originates may have developed cultural practices that moderate its influence, practices of which we remain ignorant." He waved away my concerns with the casual gesture of one dismissing trivialities. "Master, excessive caution prevented humanity from discovering fire, developing agriculture, or navigating the oceans. Great advances require the courage to embrace the unknown." But then his expression grew more serious, and I sensed that deeper currents moved beneath his enhanced consciousness. "However, I do recognize the need for discretion. Changes of this magnitude must be managed carefully to avoid social disruption." He moved to his desk and withdrew a document bearing his official seal. "I am commissioning you to serve as coordinator of a new enterprise. You will identify individuals suitable for enhancement and oversee their gradual introduction to this transformed state. We must build a network of enhanced individuals who can guide the duchy's evolution toward its destined greatness." The document he handed me carried the weight of official authority, yet I found myself reluctant to accept it. The role he proposed would make me complicit in what amounted to the systematic transformation of human nature itself, a responsibility that exceeded anything I had trained for or desired. "Your Grace," I said, "such an undertaking would require extensive research into the fruit's properties and effects. We must understand the mechanisms involved before proceeding with broader application." "Agreed," he replied immediately, his enhanced intellect apparently recognizing the logic of systematic approach. "You shall have whatever resources you require, funding, assistance, materials. But Master, time is essential. Other European powers will eventually discover similar substances, and we must maintain our advantage through early adoption." As I accepted the commission, I felt as though I were signing my name to something far more consequential than a simple administrative document. The Duke's enhanced capabilities were undeniable, yet something in his manner suggested that the price of those capabilities might prove higher than any of us currently understood. That evening I sat alone in my laboratory, surrounded by the tools and materials of my trade, contemplating a future that seemed to stretch away from everything I had believed about human nature and possibility. The specimens of the exotic fruit floated in their preservation medium like harbingers of a new age, one in which the fundamental assumptions underlying European civilization might prove obsolete. You have perhaps wondered, as you listen to this account, whether I viewed these developments as blessing or curse. The honest answer is that I could not determine the distinction. The enhanced individuals displayed capabilities that represented genuine improvements over baseline human performance. Yet something essential seemed to be lost in the process. Some quality of ordinary humanity that, once surrendered, might prove irretrievable. I had become the reluctant architect of a transformation whose ultimate consequences remained hidden in a future I lacked the enhanced consciousness to perceive. The irony was not lost on me that I, who'd introduced this change, remained trapped within the limitations of unenhanced human understanding, unable to fully comprehend what I had helped to unleash. The fourth day brought visitors whose presence confirmed my worst fears about the scope of the transformation we had initiated. Brother Giacomo arrived at dawn, his normally calm demeanour replaced by obvious agitation. He carried with him a collection of pressed plant specimens and detailed botanical drawings that suggested he had spent the night in intensive research. "Master," he said without preamble, "I have discovered references to this fruit in text that I had previously dismissed as mere folklore. Medieval chroniclers describe similar plants brought back by early crusaders, along with accounts of their effects on human consciousness." He spread his materials across my work table, pointing to illustrations that bore unmistakable resemblance to our exotic specimens. The chroniclers write of enhanced mental faculties, expanded physical capabilities, but also of changes that progressed beyond mere improvement towards something they describe as transcendence. The word carried implications that I was beginning to understand all too clearly. What became of those early experiments? "The records become vague," Brother Giacomo admitted, "but there are suggestions that entire communities underwent transformation, eventually developing into something that could no longer be considered entirely human. The chroniclers write of conflicts between enhanced and unenhanced populations that ended with the complete disappearance of the transformed communities. This historical precedent filled me with deeper dread than any of my previous concerns. If the medieval experiments had ended in social conflict and disappearance, what did that suggest about our current situation? "Brother," I said, "do these texts indicate whether the transformations proved reversible?" His expression suggested that this question had occurred to him as well. "The records are unclear, but they suggest that reversal became increasingly difficult as the changes progressed. Initially, cessation of consumption appeared to restore normal human faculties, but after extended exposure, the alteration seemed to become permanent. This information carried profound implications for our current circumstances. If the affected nobles had passed some threshold of irreversible change, then any attempt to restore them to baseline humanity might prove not merely difficult, but impossible." "How long," I asked, "does extended exposure represent?" "The texts suggest a period of 7 to 10 days, he replied, his voice carrying the particular gravity of unwelcome revelation. "Beyond that point, the transformation appears to become self-sustaining." We had now reached the 4th day since the initial consumption. If Brother Giacomo's historical research proved accurate, we possessed perhaps 3 to 6 days before the changes became permanent. The morning brought additional confirmation of the transformation's accelerating pace. Dr. Van Houten arrived with reports from his network of observing physicians. The enhanced nobles were displaying capabilities that defied rational explanation. Count Alessandro had correctly predicted the outcome of a complex trade negotiation before any of the participants had even entered the room. Lady Margherita had demonstrated the ability to perceive emotional states in others with uncanny accuracy, reading intentions and motivations as easily as one might read printed text. Most disturbing of all, the affected individuals had begun speaking of concepts that transcended normal human understanding: mathematical relationships of cosmic scope, philosophical principles that seemed to encompass the fundamental nature of reality itself. Yet when pressed to explain these insights to unenhanced listeners, they struggled to find words adequate to convey their meaning. "It is as if," Dr. Van Houten explained, "they have gained access to forms of knowledge that ordinary human consciousness cannot accommodate. They speak of seeing patterns in existence itself, of understanding connections that span from the smallest particle to the largest celestial body. This development suggested that the transformation extended far beyond simple enhancement into realms of consciousness that might properly be called supernatural. If the affected individuals were gaining access to knowledge beyond normal human capacity, then we were witnessing not merely medical treatment, but something approaching apotheosis. Yet the most disturbing report came from Dr. Van Houten's observations of the Duke himself. His Grace has begun making policy decisions with consequences extending decades into the future, the physician reported. Trade agreements that account for economic developments no normal mind could predict. Military preparations for conflicts that have not yet begun. Diplomatic initiatives based on his enhanced understanding of human nature itself. The implications were staggering. If the Duke's enhanced consciousness allowed him to perceive future developments with supernatural accuracy, then his decisions would indeed benefit the duchy in ways that normal rulers could never achieve. Yet such foresight might also lead to actions that would seem incomprehensible or threatening to other European powers. Dr. Van Houten, I said, in your professional opinion, what would be the consequences of attempting to reverse these transformations? His expression grew grave. Based on the historical accounts Brother Giacomo has uncovered, reversal at this stage would likely require measures so drastic that they might prove worse than the condition itself. We are no longer dealing with simple toxicity, but with fundamental alterations to human consciousness that may have progressed beyond the reach of conventional medicine. As afternoon approached, I found myself facing a decision that would determine not only my own future, but potentially the destiny of the entire duchy. The commission from His Grace lay before me, waiting for my formal acceptance or rejection. To accept would make me complicit in the systematic transformation of human nature itself. To refuse might be seen as betrayal of my oath to serve the Duke's interests. The choice was complicated by my growing realization that the enhanced individuals might indeed represent an improvement over baseline humanity. Their expanded capabilities, enhanced understanding, and transcendent consciousness suggested possibilities for human development that ordinary minds could scarcely imagine. Yet something essential seemed to be lost in the process, some quality of ordinary humanity that might prove more valuable than any enhancement. I had perhaps an hour to decide before His Grace expected my formal response, but that decision was removed from my hands by an event that transformed our carefully contained situation into something approaching catastrophe. The message arrived as the sun reached its zenith, delivered by a courier whose exhausted appearance suggested he had ridden through the night without rest. The seal bore the arms of France, and the contents proved to be even more disturbing than I had feared. The French ambassador had returned to Paris bearing samples of the exotic fruit, along with detailed accounts of its effects on the Savoyard court. King Henry IV himself had expressed intense interest in acquiring larger quantities of this miraculous substance, and French physicians were already conducting experiments to understand its properties. But the message contained information that filled me with deeper horror than any diplomatic complication. The French experiments had apparently progressed more rapidly than our own cautious trials. Rather than limiting consumption to small quantities, the French physicians had administered larger doses to volunteer subjects in an attempt to accelerate and amplify the transformation process. The results had been catastrophic. The volunteers had indeed undergone rapid enhancement of their mental and physical faculties, but the accelerated transformation had apparently exceeded some critical threshold. Rather than achieving the controlled transcendence observed in our subjects, The French volunteers had experienced what could only be described as complete dissociation from human reality. They retained their enhanced capabilities, but lost all connection to human emotion, morality, and social bonds. They spoke in voices that carried no trace of human warmth, expressed thoughts that revealed no concern for human welfare, and demonstrated capabilities that seemed to draw from sources beyond earthly understanding. The French physicians had attempted to reverse the process, but their efforts had only accelerated the subject's departure from recognizable humanity. Within days, the volunteers had simply disappeared, not died, not fled, but ceased to exist in any form that human perception could detect. The implications struck me like lightning. If our own enhanced subjects continued their transformation beyond some critical point, they might follow the same path into realms of existence that ordinary humans could neither comprehend nor reach. But the message contained one final piece of information that transformed concern into panic. King Henry had already ordered the preparation of similar enhancements for his entire court, convinced that the French failures resulted from inadequate dosage rather than excessive ambition. Yet the most disturbing report came from Dr. Van Houten's observations of the Duke himself. His Grace has begun making policy decisions with consequences extending decades into the future, the physician reported. Trade agreements that account for economic developments no normal mind could predict. Military preparations for conflicts that have not yet begun. Diplomatic initiatives based on his enhanced understanding of human nature itself. The implications were staggering. If the Duke's enhanced consciousness allowed him to perceive future developments with supernatural accuracy, then his decisions would indeed benefit the duchy in ways that normal rulers could never achieve. Yet such foresight might also lead to actions that would seem incomprehensible or threatening to other European powers. Dr. Van Houten, I said, in your professional opinion, what would be the consequences of attempting to reverse these transformations? His expression grew grave. Based on the historical accounts Brother Giacomo has uncovered, reversal at this stage would likely require measures so drastic that they might prove worse than the condition itself. We are no longer dealing with simple toxicity, but with fundamental alterations to human consciousness that may have progressed beyond the reach of conventional medicine. As afternoon approached, I found myself facing a decision that would determine not only my own future, but potentially the destiny of the entire duchy. The commission from His Grace lay before me, waiting for my formal acceptance or rejection. To accept would make me complicit in the systematic transformation of human nature itself. To refuse might be seen as betrayal of my oath to serve the Duke's interests. The choice was complicated by my growing realization that the enhanced individuals might indeed represent an improvement over baseline humanity. Their expanded capabilities, enhanced understanding, and transcendent consciousness suggested possibilities for human development that ordinary minds could scarcely imagine. Yet something essential seemed to be lost in the process, some quality of ordinary humanity that might prove more valuable than any enhancement. I had perhaps an hour to decide before His Grace expected my formal response, but that decision was removed from my hands by an event that transformed our carefully contained situation into something approaching catastrophe. The message arrived as the sun reached its zenith, delivered by a courier whose exhausted appearance suggested he had ridden through the night without rest. The seal bore the arms of France, and the contents proved to be even more disturbing than I had feared. The French ambassador had returned to Paris bearing samples of the exotic fruit, along with detailed accounts of its effects on the Savoyard court. King Henry IV himself had expressed intense interest in acquiring larger quantities of this miraculous substance, and French physicians were already conducting experiments to understand its properties. But the message contained information that filled me with deeper horror than any diplomatic complication. The French experiments had apparently progressed more rapidly than our own cautious trials. Rather than limiting consumption to small quantities, the French physicians had administered larger doses to volunteer subjects in an attempt to accelerate and amplify the transformation process. The results had been catastrophic. The volunteers had indeed undergone rapid enhancement of their mental and physical faculties, but the accelerated transformation had apparently exceeded some critical threshold. Rather than achieving the controlled transcendence observed in our subjects, the French volunteers had experienced what could only be described as complete dissociation from human reality. They retained their enhanced capabilities, but lost all connection to human emotion, morality, and social bonds. They spoke in voices that carried no trace of human warmth, expressed thoughts that revealed no concern for human welfare, and demonstrated capabilities that seemed to draw from sources beyond earthly understanding. The French physicians had attempted to reverse the process, but their efforts had only accelerated the subject's departure from recognizable humanity. Within days, the volunteers had simply disappeared, not died, not fled, but ceased to exist in any form that human perception could detect. The implications struck me like lightning. If our own enhanced subjects continued their transformation beyond some critical point, they might follow the same path into realms of existence that ordinary humans could neither comprehend nor reach. But the message contained one final piece of information that transformed concern into panic. King Henry had already ordered the preparation of similar enhancements for his entire court, convinced that the French failures resulted from inadequate dosage rather than excessive ambition. If the French court underwent mass transformation, the political balance of Europe would shift in ways that ordinary minds could not predict or counter. Enhanced French nobles with transcendent capabilities could easily dominate unenhanced rivals from other nations, potentially ushering in an age of French supremacy that would last for centuries. Unless, of course, their enhanced subjects also disappeared into whatever realm had claimed the experimental volunteers. I raced through the palace corridors toward His Grace's study, the French dispatch clutched in my trembling hands. The guards at his door stepped aside without question, recognizing the urgency written across my features. I found the Duke standing at his window, but his posture suggested that he was observing far more than the physical landscape spread before him. His enhanced consciousness apparently allowed him to perceive patterns and relationships that remained invisible to normal vision. "Your Grace," I gasped, still breathless from my desperate journey through the palace. "We have received word from France that changes everything." He turned to face me, and I saw in his eyes a depth of understanding that seemed to encompass not merely my immediate concern, but the entire web of consequences that would flow from this development. "The French experiments," he said calmly, apparently having anticipated this news through means I could not fathom. "They have proceeded too rapidly and without adequate understanding of the forces involved. Your Grace, the volunteers have departed from recognizable existence, and King Henry plans to extend the treatment to his entire court." The Duke's expression grew thoughtful, but showed no trace of the alarm I'd expected. Master Whitmore, enhanced consciousness, brings with it the ability to perceive consequences that remain hidden from ordinary understanding. The French failure was inevitable, given their approach to the process. His casual dismissal of the French catastrophe filled me with deeper unease. If the Duke's enhanced perspective had led him to view human disappearance as merely an expected outcome, what did that suggest about his own relationship to recognizable humanity? "Your Grace," I pressed, "what of our own enhanced subjects? Do they face the same risk?" "Only if they proceed without proper guidance," he replied, his voice carrying the particular authority of enhanced understanding. "The indigenous peoples from whom this fruit originates possess knowledge that prevented such outcomes. We must learn their methods before attempting further enhancement." This was the first indication he had given that the transformation process might require moderation rather than acceleration. Yet something in his manner suggested that his concern stemmed not from any desire to preserve ordinary humanity, but from strategic calculation about maintaining useful capabilities. "Master," he continued, "your role becomes even more critical in light of these developments. We must develop controlled enhancement procedures that avoid the French mistakes while maximizing the benefits of transcendent consciousness." The commission he had offered suddenly took on dimensions that extended far beyond the duchy's borders. If we could master the enhancement process while other powers stumbled toward catastrophic failure, Savoy might indeed emerge as a dominant force in European politics. Yet as I studied the Duke's enhanced features, I found myself wondering whether that dominance would be exercised by humans at all, or by beings who had transcended human limitations so completely that ordinary mortals could no longer recognize their essential nature. "Your Grace," I asked carefully, "what are your ultimate objectives for this enhancement program?" His smile carried implications that seemed to encompass possibilities I lacked the enhanced consciousness to fully understand. "Master, we stand at the threshold of human evolution itself. The choice before us is simple: advance to the next stage of conscious development, or remain trapped within the limitations that have constrained our species since the dawn of creation." The scope of his vision was breathtaking, yet something in its grandeur filled me with existential terror. If humanity itself was to be transcended, what would become of all the qualities, both noble and base, that had defined our species throughout history? And if the price of that advancement proves to be humanity itself, "Then we will have traded a temporary condition for eternal transcendence," he replied without hesitation. "Master, you cannot make such decisions from the perspective of ordinary human consciousness. Enhanced understanding reveals that what we call humanity is merely a transitional stage, no more permanent or valuable than the caterpillar's form before it achieves its destined transformation into something capable of flight." That evening, I sat alone in my laboratory, contemplating a choice that would determine not merely my own fate, but potentially the future of human consciousness itself. The commission lay before me, its official seals gleaming in the candlelight like eyes that watched my every movement. To accept would make me complicit in the systematic transformation of human nature, a process whose ultimate destination remained shrouded in mystery, but whose early stages suggested possibilities both magnificent and terrible. To refuse would mean abandoning enhanced individuals to pursue their transcendence without guidance or moderation, a path that might lead either to unprecedented human achievement or to the complete extinction of recognizable humanity. Yet as I weighed these alternatives, a third possibility began to form in my mind, one that carried risks as great as either acceptance or refusal. but which might offer hope for preserving what was valuable in human nature, while avoiding the catastrophic extremes that had claimed the French volunteers. The idea was audacious, dangerous, and probably doomed to failure. But as the candle burned lower and shadows gathered around my workspace, I began to see it as the only course that might allow both enhanced and unenhanced humanity to survive the transformation that was already beyond any power to prevent. I would need to work quickly, carefully, and in absolute secrecy. The enhanced subjects were progressing toward their transcendence with each passing hour, and once they crossed whatever threshold had claimed the French volunteers, no human agency would be capable of influencing their destiny. But first, I needed to understand exactly what that threshold represented, and whether it might be possible to approach it without crossing into realms from which there could be no return. The night stretched before me like an ocean of possibility and terror, and somewhere in its depths lay answers that might save or damn everything I had ever valued about the strange, limited, precious condition we called humanity. I rose from my chair, gathered the materials I would need for the most important experiment of my career, and began preparations for a gamble that would either redeem my inadvertent role in unleashing these forces or complete the catastrophe I had helped to initiate. The candle flame flickered as I worked, casting dancing shadows that seemed to whisper of transformations yet to come, and of a future where the very definition of human consciousness hung in the balance of choices made by fallible minds in the deepest hours of a world-changing night. Here I must conclude this first portion of my account, for what followed requires explanation of events so strange that even now, 40 years hence, I struggle to find words adequate to convey their full significance. The commission from His Grace remained unsigned upon my table, while in chambers throughout the palace, enhanced nobles continued their inexorable progression toward whatever transcendence awaited those who had tasted the devil's apple, and found in its foreign flesh the seeds of humanity's possible future, or its certain end. The choices I made in the hours that followed changed not only my own destiny, but the course of events that would echo through the courts of Europe for generations to come. Whether I proved saviour or destroyer in that long night's work remains a judgment I leave to others, for I'm no longer certain that the distinction carries the meaning I once believed it possessed. The red fruit floats still in its preserving spirits, unchanged by time or revelation, waiting perhaps for another curious soul to discover what terrible gifts it holds for those bold enough or foolish enough to taste the unknown.